Good morning. Before we begin this morning, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that I am joining you today from our nation's capital, which is located on the ancestral territory of the Ottman Nation. We as a panel also extend our respect to all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation for their valuable past, present, and future contributions to this land. We also recognize and respect the cultural diversity that First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation bring to our country. I would also just like to take a moment to thank two colleagues of mine on my team who have put a lot of work to pulling this panel together today. Angie Griesberg and Reg Parsons, thank you very much for all the work that you've put in for the panel, and then I'm very fortunate to have on my team to continue working on many of the themes that we'll be discussing today. Also special thanks to Stratos and Emily Caddell in particular, who have helped us in supporting us with this panel today. My name is Natalka Cmoc. I am a new Director General with Laboratories Canada with the Science and Parliamentary Infrastructure Branch at Public Services and Procurement Canada. Laboratories Canada has just recently been made public, so we're very happy to be able to speak to that today. It's a 25-year strategy that will deliver on the vision of to how to strengthen federal science in Canada, really focused on a lot of the enabling qualities that would be required, in particular physical laboratories, which is a topic that we're going to be discussing as well today. So we've brought together a fantastic panel for you for this discussion today, and the discussion really will be focused on approaches on how best to advance the application of multiple knowledge systems into the development and delivery of federal science, as well as knowledge generation of Indigenous communities. And this includes, like I mentioned, a little bit of that, making sure that we have and are building future research and laboratory spaces, physical spaces, infrastructure, even where they're located, to support this knowledge co-production, which is critical that we create an ethical, safe space for to facilitate stronger ties, communication, and discussion. So today our panel brings various experience and perspectives from both Western and Science Indigenous knowledge systems. Each person on the panel brings several perspectives, so really they'll be speaking with their multiple voice that they bring. And they'll be speaking about the facilities, laboratories design. They'll be advising Laboratories Canada on how do we extend research and laboratories into Indigenous territory. How do we better involve Indigenous communities to participate in knowledge creation? I've had the pleasure to listen to some of the other panel discussions at the conference, and I know that what we're raising today and what we're going to be discussing this panel has been actually raised in other panels, so it's really exciting to be able to bring this forward. And it seems to be a continuous theme throughout the conference. So we're not an isolated topic here. We're in fact part of something that's being brought in on various topics, and that includes the importance of collaboration, the importance of reciprocity, and even decolonization, whether it's in science research or in physical space. So I know that our panelists today will be raising these topics as well. So I'm really excited to be presenting with Ms. Melody Lepine, who's a member of Treaty 8 Mikisew-Cree First Nation. She's the Director of Mikisew-Cree First Nation Government and Industry Relations. And in this position, she oversees and manages Indigenous community interface with industry and government, including scientific and technical program delivery related to environmental monitoring and research, environmental, human health, and risk assessments. and the balance and teachings of both traditional knowledge and Western science has become her key strength in her professional career. And as it so happens, she has also had interactions with Dr. Fred Wrona, who's also a panelist here. So I hope that that comes out in our discussions as well. Dr. Fred Wrona is joining us today from Victoria, so it's super early for him. Fred is currently the Special Advisor to Laboratories Canada, and as of this summer, he has he's actually right now still, Professor of the SFAR Research Chair in Integrated Watershed Science in University of Calgary. And till very recently, he was the Chief Scientist and ADM of the Environmental Monitoring Science Division for Alberta Environment and Parks. Fred has over 30 years of environmental research and science policy linkage experience in Canada and internationally, working with Indigenous communities, academia, multiple levels of government, stakeholder organizations, and the private sector. I'm also happy to present Dr. Jacqueline Ottman, who is Anishinaabe from Fishing Lake First Nations. She is a professor and the inaugural Vice-Provost of Indigenous Engagement at the University of Saskatchewan, and developed in collaboration with the communities the Indigenous strategy for the university that is Indigenous-led and created and gifted to the university. Jacqueline has been recognized as an international researcher, advocate, and change maker whose purpose is to transform practices inclusive of Indigenous leadership, methodologies, and pedagogies. Dr. David Fortin is a member of the Métis Nation of Ontario. He's Associate Professor and Director of the McEwen School of Architecture at Laurentian University, and a member of the Indigenous Task Force of the Royal Architecture Institute of Canada that seeks ways to foster and promote Indigenous design. I am very thrilled to have him here because him and I have actually collaborated on another initiative with Indigenous Services Canada. It's called the Indigenous Homes Innovation Initiative. And I have personally learned a lot from Dr. Fortin in terms of the importance of design, working design as a participatory approach with Indigenous communities and not designed for necessarily. So I'm hoping he's going to speak a little bit to that today. So the format for today is that there'll be no formal presentations, but we do have some questions that will be an interactive question and answer with the panel. And after that, we'll open it up to the audience. So please do, I encourage you to log any questions throughout the conference. And we hope to have a significant portion of our session devoted to question and answer with the audience. So please do. I hope that there's a button that allows you to answer the questions. So please do use that. So with that, I will begin our first question. So the title of our session is Advancing Science Through the Braiding of Multiple Knowledge Systems. What does braiding knowledge mean to you, and how would you define it? Perhaps we could start with you, Melody.
Good morning, everyone. I think that's a fairly important question for my line of work. Actually, it's quite critical as I undertake environmental assessment reviews, lead community-based monitoring, and really have to integrate both knowledge systems in identifying mitigation and adaptive management to address environmental impacts. I can use a really good positive example as we supported some policy development by the provincial government in developing a framework to manage water withdrawals. So we utilized Mikisew knowledge to identify the Athabasca River stream flow. We called it the Aboriginal extreme flow, which is a threshold. I believe it was 400 meters per second. And that threshold, really utilizing Indigenous knowledge, was to support the amount of water that industry could withdraw from the Athabasca River without impeding and affecting Mikisew use of the river, primarily navigation. So this is where we felt it was necessary to make key decisions on issuing water licenses, managing flow of the river, to support Mikisew rights and culture and use of the river, but to also help government make informed decisions, to work with also developers as they work on better technologies in terms of reducing the reliance on fresh water from the river. So it's important to integrate or utilize both knowledge systems in things like adaptive management and policy development. So yeah, I think that's a great question. Thank you, Natalka.
It's a great example. I'm opening it up to any of the other panelists if they also might want to bring forward an example just to illustrate give a good example of what we're discussing today.
I'm happy to jump in, Natalka. I think one of the things for me when we talk about bringing knowledge is to remember that at some level it's a philosophical question, because people are all seeking truth in the end, and science has its own sort of methods to arriving at what truth is, how you make truth veritable, and then there are other forms of knowledge, and you can combine them and still be respectful of each for its own sort of path. So for me, in architecture, for instance, you think of building science, and you can look. We study a lot across the country of different building typologies, and different building typologies all respond environmentally to their location with Indigenous buildings, and the way they perform can be often very well linked to contemporary building science, looking at a wall section and understanding how ventilation works, how air moves through it. So you can overlap Indigenous teachings of buildings with contemporary building science, and turn that into this kind of technical solution. But if it isn't a space that honors, for instance, the cardinal directions in certain programs, if it isn't a space that welcomes elders and isn't a place where stories can happen, then it doesn't perform. You can technically design a silver box and say, oh, it's informed by a teepee. But if it doesn't embody the kind of teachings of the ancestors and becomes a space where the other forms of knowledge can thrive, then it fails. So you need an understanding of both. And similarly, we can't all live in teepees and igloos, despite that being sometimes a common misperception that happens. So we have to lean on contemporary building science, but we also have to understand how to use that in the appropriate way, and that's where it gets strong.
What are some of the benefits and challenges in braiding knowledge? What are ways that we can ensure some success? Maybe, Jackie, I could ask you to lead us off.
Thank you, Natalka. And I think with there are so many benefits, and there's also a knowing that with increased diversity of perspectives, and that would include knowledges and understandings, then organizations and initiatives would only be strengthened. And so that's an important place to begin is actually are we open to learning from and weaving, in this case, Indigenous knowledges into some of the work that we're doing. And it's hard work. And the benefits are tremendous. You get engaged, more people engaged on certain initiatives and projects and strategic work. And there is more of that sense of ownership. And more importantly, I think you get fresh, according to, in this case, the Academy, you get fresh ideas, right? And that's actually, I say that with a lot of reluctance, because the teachings, as David was talking about, many of them are very ancient, and so they're still relevant today. And they still have a place within the development of our sciences, because Indigenous peoples have strong understanding of science and always have. and there is evidence of this also. And so for some reason, there was exclusion, and I think we know what those reasons are too. But so how do we draw those voices, those perspectives back to the table, be more inclusive and equitable and accessible, so we could actually all benefit from the Indigenous perspectives, the knowledges, the ideas that Indigenous peoples have to offer.
Fred, did you want to add something? Melody, please go ahead, Melody.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think at least in my line of work, I believe that the benefits are just really achieving a more holistic and inclusive outcome, especially in the areas of policy development, as my last example alluded to. I think just with a more holistic worldview of inclusiveness of Indigenous participation, I think you're going to get a significant, stronger result. And it really places a stronger value on community participation. There's the effort towards reconciliation and, stronger inclusiveness of Indigenous people. So I think recognizing how valuable and sacred, our knowledge is a significant benefit for progressing reconciliation. I recognize there's also challenges in utilizing Indigenous knowledge, and this is some of the work that Fred and I have experienced in the Indigenous Wisdom Panel. And that sometimes could be about, the protection of Indigenous knowledge, some of the intellectual property rights, as well as sometimes the lack of understanding from those that are utilizing it. And so there's often mistrust because Indigenous knowledge often gets misused. So that is, I think, a significant challenge, but I believe that that can be addressed. The more it is training and that is undertaken by, for example, federal science teams to firmly understand the importance of the knowledge and really developing relationships with Indigenous communities can really help take on that challenge.
Fred, I thought I saw you wanting to also add something. You're on mute, Fred.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
No, my mic's on. Can you hear me?
Now we can hear you.
Okay, super. Just building on what some of the other panelists have mentioned on this topic, I think one thing that's interesting about this is take a look at the issues that we're facing as a society nowadays, ranging from the one that's eminent and right in our faces, COVID, to many of the environmental, social, and other issues that we need to deal with in terms of having credible, informed decision-making to policymakers and other groups. I think Melody hit it right on the head by saying that what we have by having a recognition of both the importance of Indigenous perspectives and Western, what I would call more Western conventional science perspective, the braiding and the merger of the two of those particular philosophies. So irrespective of the epistemological origin, whether you're dealing with Indigenous or scientific knowledge, you actually have a more complete picture about what the issue is, how to potentially resolve problems with it, how to approach it, and very importantly, more inclusive engagement of groups, including, very importantly now, the communities and the public and others in terms of addressing that question. So I think, again, conventional Western science tends to have been, trained as a conventional Western scientist. It was more reductionist. It was really honing the question down. And I think one of the things and the great examples we have in working with Indigenous knowledge systems is that you have a broader view and a broader, inclusive, holistic view of the problem and the issue. And I think the co-benefit of having both of those perspectives is where we're getting the advances that we need in terms of advancing the knowledge to apply to our problems.
I would like to actually discuss that a little bit more. So the defining the science research questions. That's been also discussed in some of the other panel discussions, and I would have loved to have had you in that conversation. Maybe you had listened in, but it was sort of discussing who defines the research from a federal science perspective, and there was a little bit of debate on that. That it does not, that it could be more open to be able to define what the problem is, so that you can make sure that you're creating more an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approach to some of this. How do you see the role, and how could you facilitate that with Indigenous communities, so that they're actually contributing to defining some of the problems that should be examined by federal science? Any views from anyone?
I can
certainly take a first stab at it. Sure. One of the things that I think in terms of how can federal science basically move forward on this is, I think, beginning to get an understanding of how to approach communities and approach Indigenous organizations in terms of obtaining that dialogue. It's really a matter of being able to go into the communities in the right ethical space with them, the right cultural space, to basically be open to the dialogue and to listen. That type of training, that type of work is not necessarily automatically done in many of the federal science systems. I was involved in many years in federal science where you had both research managers, program directors, scientists sitting around the table saying that these are the key issues that we need to deal with, and how are we going to advance them. Very rarely, historically, did you actually have an Indigenous view or perspective in terms of what those issues are and how to bring that dialogue to the table. I think, but that will take training. It will actually take training on behalf and understanding on behalf of the science community of how to do this properly. And I think that's something that needs to be worked on.
Jackie, you want to tell?
Yes, so there are actually documents that have been created, or a document that has been developed by SSHRC, and it was developed in consultation with Indigenous peoples from across the country. And so that particular document is setting directions to support Indigenous research and training in Canada 2019 to 2022. And so there are three engagement goals. And first of all, they should be reciprocal. And one of them is building of new relationships of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples. So you're establishing a new way of working together. And because there's, as Melody said, there in some cases there is very little trust. And so those bridges need to be developed first, or built. And then there's co-development, and then there's a coordinated approach. And so Indigenous peoples have to be engaged from the very beginning of some of these research initiatives. And so in my, because I'm still an active researcher, when I had Indigenous communities coming to me and saying, we have these questions, would you help us answer them? And so as a researcher, that was hugely significant to me, in a sense that these questions were originating from community, and that they, just because they were, the potential for them to have lasting impact, sustainable impact increases, right? And so I'm essentially facilitating the research, and the research belongs with the community. So it's in some cases not even co-creating, in a sense, as it is taking lead from Indigenous peoples. And so that takes, and that's how we built our Indigenous strategy, and that's a whole other discussion. But there's protocol that's a part of this for Indigenous peoples who've done research for, you know, centuries and centuries and centuries. It always began with protocol, and then astute observation, active listening, and then dissemination is storytelling and oracy. So there are parallel forms of conducting research.
Melody, would you maybe want to describe the research protocols that that you encourage when working with your nation?
Yeah, no, there's several examples of research protocols, and we have some bad examples as well, where, you know, often researchers come into the community, and I spoke about mistrust that was echoed by Jacqueline, but you know, one aspect and proactive way that we're trying to deal with, you know, just a lot of researchers not understanding or adhering to our community protocols is taking on research ourselves. And welcome them into our circle. So one initiative that is really important to us is developing something that we're calling the Delta Institute. So we have, you know, the world's largest freshwater delta, right in the center, an important area for Mikisew-Cree and Dene and Cree culture. And this is, you know, what our vision of the Delta Institute is, to help support research, to help protect the Delta. And welcome in the academic world, to welcome science researchers from the federal and provincial governments. But really it's built on the foundation and rooted with Indigenous knowledge. So using a very community-based value system within environmental protection and conservation, and utilizing that to drive research to, you know, basically the goal is protecting the Delta, the way of life and livelihood of the Mikisew people. So there are probably several examples like that across the country. And we really need the support of federal government and other institutions to help financially, you know, get these institutes off the ground and running. We're faced with numerous challenges, of course, but I really think when communities identify that they are willing to do something like a Delta Institute, there needs to be pathways set for them to, you know, help deliver success of such research institutes, because I think they could really open up the areas in terms of environmental protection and other areas of culture and heritage. But there are probably several other examples. But we just really stress the importance of the government to recognize and really fully support other initiatives as well, such as community-based monitoring, ways to apply policy with inclusiveness of Indigenous views, to, I guess, ultimately the goal for us, and why we have Indigenous knowledge. Our knowledge has sustained us since time immemorial. You know, I've seen my grandparents live off the land and utilize their knowledge of the land to support their way of life and their culture. How can we utilize the value of that in policy to help protect, for example, address issues like climate change and other areas of conservation of our natural ecosystems?
We know that we hear this a lot, that federal science needs to figure out how it can be more agile and responsive, and especially quick to action, you know, whether it's having been more prepared for COVID, for example, or other crises like climate change, as you mentioned yourself, but to support that evidence-based decisions for like some of these high priority areas, in addition to making sure that we're enabling sort of innovative approaches, collaborative partnerships, and ensuring, you know, even contributing to Canada's competitiveness. All of that is part of what would strengthen federal science, which is done very well, but we're always looking at ways on how it can be done even better. And the sort of design thinking is an important and critical aspect here, whether it's designing a space or an approach, and to accommodate different perspectives and include them very proactively as well. And I'm wondering, David, as an Indigenous architect, how do you ensure that an approach, whether it's through your own work or through the teaching of your students, how do you ensure that you're creating spaces that are culturally appropriate and enable the braiding of knowledge systems?
Yeah, it's a challenge, and I think historically in our country, just to raise a little bit of awareness, there are only currently roughly 18 Indigenous architects in the country. So historically, people might have only known of one or two. So often would be the case, an architect would get a project in a northern community, let's say on a First Nation for a community center or a school or something, and they've never worked with an Indigenous community in their lives. They don't really know anything about Indigenous culture, and then they have a month to design this space that is going to raise children for the next 100 years in that space, and then they're kind of in a panic asking that question. Well, we got to figure out how to design this. We got like 3 weeks, and none of us know what we're doing. And so the question that you start off with, this question of nimble and being reactive, and in my opinion, it can't happen quickly in a sense, because one of the ways we teach our students, I mean, in architecture, we sort of, we blur that line, I think, between sciences and the arts. And one of the things we've seen over the years is that the visuality of Indigenous people, or the novelty of Indigenous forms and stuff, is very interesting to architects and designers. So it becomes very quick for them to jump onto a kind of superficial understanding of Indigenous teachings and try to express that in a kind of interesting way that kind of makes their portfolio look culturally diverse. But they don't get to the kind of deeper system. So, one of the things that I promote in terms of Indigenous design are 3 R's, which is relationships, respect, and reciprocity. So the first one is that architecture is about building relationships first and foremost. So, rather than designing some theoretical project for some remote, exotic First Nation, look to where you live, build relationships with the people around you, build relationships with the communities nearest your university, and learn. And it's a slow learning process, and fold that into your program over time, slowly, because it's a real slow absorption process. One of the biggest things that I find is language. Even in Sudbury here, I'm learning little bits and pieces of Anishinaabe, because that's respectful. And you can't, in a 1 month time frame, turn around and understand all the teachings of Anishinaabe. Or if you look at Cree and the prairies and various Indigenous languages, that even the sounds of the words are linked to animals or places in the land. So even when you speak in those languages, you're tying yourself to the land. Like, we've got, at a real fundamental level, there's already a disconnect there. So, we really emphasize that idea of being humble and being listening first and foremost with communities and knowledge carriers, and build from that. And then, similar to what the other panels have said, that there has to be an understanding that you're not there to extract knowledge. You're there to share and learn, and give something back to the community. Every time, one of the things we keep asking ourselves is, what is the community benefiting from us being involved here? And if there's not a real understandable idea of what that is, then you're probably off track. So those are all sort of factors. And I really do think that to answer the way you frame the question in terms of responding to things that actually need kind of nimble and action, you need to have Indigenous people that you can go to in those cases, because it's just the reality that someone who's not sort of been how do I say, raised or familiarized, and not only that, someone who actually believes in and embodies Indigenous knowledge. It's just, like I said, you can't just turn that over in a day or two. It's a slow process. So I really believe in the idea of lifting up the Indigenous peoples, and I would follow up what Melody said, that the Indigenous institutes and things that need to be supported. So there is a knowledge base that can be turned to in various different ways when needed.
I've heard in some of our discussions the importance of location, for example, thinking differently about research and laboratory space, making them more welcoming. I believe Melody once in one of our conversations mentioned the idea of an outdoor lab, for example. How, and yet laboratories take so long to build. So it's a long initiative, and so what would be some tips of how you would think about designing laboratories so that you can use them sooner the better, having them more open and thinking of bringing outdoor in or having that sort of flexibility. So it's a big question, and I'm just going to put it out there and see if anybody wants to touch it. But even in terms of not just federal science, but with universities and making it a lot more collaborative and interesting and open to the communities themselves, Indigenous communities themselves, so they would feel very welcome. What could be done?
I could share an example of what we do annually with departments within the federal government, Environment Canada and Department of Fisheries, is we host an annual outdoor fish camp, and we call it our annual white fish camp. And it's basically an outdoor laboratory where fish biologists from Department of Fisheries and Environment staff basically come and work with our local fishermen, our knowledge holders, to identify basically just the habitat requirements, looking at the health of fish. There's participation from the youth, from school-age children, that this is sort of their science, part of their science curriculum as well. And this is where both knowledge systems are being braided. Like it's in a very comfortable space. It's out on the land, it's out on the delta. And so we are, this is, our culture is to host, and we're very we're hospitality driven, and we welcome these researchers into our homes, into our cabins, out into the field, and they show us like what is important for them to collect in terms of data, to look at, for example, mercury in whitefish. Whitefish is a very important fish for us. It's a staple in our food, and so we want to answer. We want the a question of, is our health, of our fish safe to eat? And so we have basically an outdoor laboratory collecting the information, setting fish nets, and so there's just this. It's a very beautiful experience where you just see the sense of pride from the community, the sharing and the passing of knowledge to the youth and future generations. They learn from the Western scientists, the biologists that are there, how to dissect the fish and collect it, the protocols for how to put it in the different containers, and the sterilization and the chain of custody forms, and sending it off to the lab in Winnipeg. And then later we visited the lab in Winnipeg. Some of our knowledge holders went and traveled and experienced the laboratory, what it was like. Here is our actual collection of the fish that we went out into the land and collected, and they've seen the full sort of life cycle of how, both being on the land and the outdoor laboratory, as well as the lab in Winnipeg, and then seeing the results, the reports of saying it is safe to eat the fish. The mercury levels are low, the arsenic levels are low. It's okay, but we're going to continue to do this type of research, answer questions that are important to your community. And that was fulfilling, and this is how we start to bridge that trust issue, as well as supporting community-based initiatives like a simple fish camp, but as well as supporting the ability to pass on from those elders and land users, passing on to the young children that were also participating. And this is a key component in us sharing our knowledge, is also the ability to support programs for us to retain our culture and pass it on to the youth and future generations.
That's a great example.
Well, maybe I could. Oh, sorry, Dave, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to just give it an example worth looking up for people interested, and maybe some of you already know, but the Living with Lake Center here at Laurentian University, which is built on Lake Ramsey, is a really good example of a science facility for fresh water. that is, it undulates along the river, the edge of the lake. It looks out at the lake, so all the lab spaces are engaged with the water. At the ground level, you're surrounded by trees and outdoor space. They put blueberries on top of the flat roof so people can go out and pick berries. And the whole building is sort of honoring energy and water, sunlight, used in very clever ways. So you find a common ground of what the value systems are, and you can find something really amazing. And I would just add too, many universities are adding these spaces for Indigenous people across the country, and it's very exciting. And I don't know, particularly in the hard sciences, how often ceremony might happen, but creating spaces where you can smudge, where you can invite elders into a laboratory, I think that's it's not done very often. But why not start planning for that now? It allows that invitation that you've asked about.
Sorry, go ahead, Fred. I have to mute and unmute or else the feedback's bad.
It's unmuted now. Actually, David picked up on what I was going to talk about, is in terms of some of the directions that Labs Canada, as we're embarking at very early stages about how to approach this, is exactly along the lines of what are the types of requirements do we want to have? What kind of facilities and space do we want to have to make this a welcoming space for the various cultures, various perspectives, to basically have open dialogue, ceremonial components. I mean, I know that I was very fortunate in the role that I had as chief scientist with Alberta Environment and Parks. Is under legislation, I actually formally had 2 committees that were to advise myself and the minister and the department on in terms of our science programs and our monitoring systems or whatever. And Melly could speak, she could certainly have examples herself of this. It took us a few years to basically work with the 2 committees so that we actually became more than 2 committees. We actually began to do the braiding and the discussion of trust in a trustworthy way, in a trustworthy environment, in terms of how to advance some of the issues that we needed to deal with. Often we found facilities to do that with were unavailable in a conventional way. You could not run smudge ceremonies properly. You kind of had to go outside and set something up temporarily because there's just no way to actually have the ethical space to do the work that we needed to do. And in fact, if you recall, Melanie, a lot of our best discussions were actually outdoors. We as panelists went and walked along the Ottman River, or we walked along other areas, and many of the Indigenous members there were actually wanting the Western Science Committee members and all of us to come back into the communities, and I think very importantly, as Melody said, to host. So the discussions are not necessarily done in just formal boardrooms and formal discussions, but you actually are developing relationships between the organizations and people, and those relationships take on a different human and social dimension. To actually, you need to have spaces conducive to that, and ability to do that, and I would argue that our conventional labs and approaches, the way we've done, is really not the way to go. I think that, David, the example that you gave of the new architectural designs that are being done, in other areas, are something that we have to start looking at, of providing that kind of infrastructure that enables. It's got to be enabling this type of interaction rather than prohibiting and creating barriers to it.
Always takes me a second to unmute. So we've also wanted to just talk about and sort of Indigenous-led research, which we've been talking about a little bit over some of the other questions. But I'm wondering if do you think that some kind of formalized approach would benefit or hinder that initiative to really, what would make it? I'm always thinking it from a policies perspective, and policies are important, and in terms of policy formulation, but also policy to encourage a change. Do you think that actual policies put in place to encourage Indigenous-led research would help? And what would it take? So I know funding is obviously one element. Is there anything else, if you could design it yourself, and or you're providing advice to how you would design good policy formulation in this area, what would you recommend needs to be considered? You had talked about advisory groups, for example, making the spaces, how you make the spaces more welcoming. Is there anything else that you would like to add to any of what we've mentioned so far?
Well, one of the things I think that needs to be recognized is that there are Indigenous groups have been developing formal documents outlining research in their territories. And one would be the National Inuit Strategy on Research. And so that is a framework of engagement in relation to science. And there's the Mi'kmaq Ethics Watch, right? And so that's been around for some time, and that community came together to outline how they want to engage in research with scientists outside their community. And there's also the First Nations Information Governance Center, and they are enact, and they're the keepers of OCAP, ownership, control, access, and possession of intellectual property as it relates to First Nation communities. So more and more we're having communities develop these guidelines, develop these guidelines. And so since they're in existence already, how do they connect and relate to, let's say, something that Chapter 9 of the Tri-Council document. And so there's some of that work, I think, that could be done prior to just invitations that might occur between organizations. And so those are very, very important. And so in relation to policies, really, how does your data management processes look? Because there's documents within organizations that pertain to data management. I know we do at universities, and there are trustees to data management. And so is there Indigenous representation within those formal circles? And especially in our case, when we have such a high Indigenous population in Saskatchewan, and also within our university, there should be representation within each one of these decision-making tables or policy developing tables.
Somebody else wanted to join in before I move on.
If I could just add one item about, just to touch on your question, Natalka, I would also suggest, like, a theme that we've all been saying is, support community driven research institutes within the communities. But I think another reciprocate that is that there also needs to be capacity built within the federal science system. So, one of the things that came up within my work with Fred on the provincial level is encouraging more positions within the provincial government, Indigenous knowledge positions, more training for science staff in the areas of Indigenous knowledge. So that capacity will help promote further understanding on the value of Indigenous knowledge within the federal system. So I think that would be a great value as well. That I'm a strong community Indigenous advocate, always looking for capacity support to do the work that I do. But I also see much value when I'm sitting with members of the federal team, sometimes with their lack of understanding. And sometimes I wish that, they had the ability to have some capacity to support the work that they're doing within the federal government.
I did see a question that we received, and somebody was asking very specifically that they would love to hear some examples, if you have any, of braiding knowledge and how that could help advance the research on climate change. So that was one of the questions we received. I'm just putting that forward.
Well, I could maybe provide an example that we started. Again, the degree to which that it's evolved and actually being implemented yet is still, I would say, in early stages. But one of the thoughts that we had in the role that I had in Alberta is actually developing an Indigenous-led climate observing system. So that it comes back to what was talked about before, is that actually getting identified indicators of climate variability and change that are identified and monitored and assessed by Indigenous communities across an environmental gradient. It could be across a province, it could be across nationally. We also wanted to do something along those lines under International Polar Year and other programs like that, where you have communities that are place-based in a range of environmental conditions within the Canadian landscape, and actually in the circumpolar Arctic for that matter, and using those observing systems in informing both the rate of change and what we're seeing related to climate change, but also very importantly beginning to inform what I would call adaptation actions to increasing and the more variable climate. And that information, most of that information, came from communities, because the communities were in the best position. They were best place-based to make not only observations, but help to inform the Western science communities that we often would follow up with instrumentation or other types of observations that would augment what was being seen by the local communities themselves. So I think the climate issue is a very good example of where I think the success of that program as you move forward would be predicated very strongly on appropriate involvement and engagement of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous communities across the landscape.
If I could just jump in briefly on that as well. I'm getting some feedback there. Buildings produce about 40% of greenhouse gas emissions, and this is not to blame all the architects for a lot of it, but certainly it falls on our shoulders. And one of the things that we do at our university, at our school, which was started before I got there, but is to work with an Indigenous elder, and all of our architecture students build a birch bark canoe, for example, in second year. In the last couple of years, they've been working on wigwams. And some people say, well, why are you doing that? Like, that has no relevance to contemporary architecture at all. And yeah, it might be true that there are more efficient ways to do these things, but the teachings that come with the birch bark canoe are phenomenal, because the form of the canoe has never been perfected any better than it has been for thousands of years. It uses all completely natural materials. It perfectly connects people to each other and to the land. So it has a kind of a utility to it, utility value. And then when it's done its use, you walk it into the forest and you lay it down, and Mother Earth takes it back. And if you look at the way Indigenous people built buildings, there's a book that talks about Indigenous architecture, and at some point in it, I've always criticized it because it says, Indigenous people had no choice but to use the materials available to them, but as if mining and these other materials weren't options. But it's a value system. It wasn't that they weren't options. It's just that the way that they built was holistically tied into their whole worldview. So, I think, like, for me, climate change, and you look at the factors, we keep on thinking that that some mystery technology is going to fix everything. But actually, if you look at passive building systems and just using things like harnessing the sun's energy in the right ways and being smart with the way you insulate and position a building, you can get rid of a lot of that. And so I think like for us, Indigenous teachings provide a kind of grounding in thinking about how we think about buildings and energy use that can be pretty profound because the industry has been so commercialized that it's driven by a whole bunch of different factors than actual proper building values.
I agree, and I think you know, with Indigenous peoples are connected to territory, and you know, the Cree people have been on the plains for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, right? And so there's this intimate knowledge and relationship that people have to a certain place. And so there is that understanding of how to be respectful and resourceful and in relationship with the plants and the materials that are all around. And so, of course, there's the philosophy that all is animate, right? And so that immediately has you thinking about the sustainability of all that's around you. So there's philosophies on sustainability, just like the teaching of all my relations, which means that all humanity is related, and all humanity is related to creation and to the cosmos. So we have a responsibility to each other. And even the teachings of the medicine wheel, that's all about balance in some way, holistic balance, and that's something that we've been talking about today. The philosophy of 7 generations speaks to learning from patterns of the past, so we can have a clear, a better understanding of how we got to where we are today, so we can make better decisions for children not yet born 7 generations into the future. So that's a sustainable, you know, it's a sustainability perspective. And so we always talk about respect, and if we're not respecting our environment, then, you know, there's going to be implications. In my language, which is Anishinaabewin, it's teacher is a kinamage, so a kin is the land. Mioma is like right here. And the other part of the word is a directive. So basically, land is the first teacher, and you know, so it's your immediate context. And so, in relation to sustainability, there are teachings that are around that. We are taught to be sustainable when we pick, you know, sweetgrass. Or certain plants. And elders, I was listening to Dr. Gregory Kehete probably about 20 years ago. He's a Pueblo scholar, and he said elders are very concerned about the state of the world. And so elders knew about the climate change well before, I'll say, they tried to sound the alarm well before our scientists did. And so we have to listen to each other. We have to, because Indigenous people see themselves as stewards of these places and spaces. So they have to be included within these tables that are talking about climate change policy, you know, and sustainability.
I've heard many of you use the word reciprocity, and it might not be intuitive to everyone. So I wanted to just take a minute just to, maybe you could say a few words about that. Why is reciprocity important, especially in scientific work?
If I could just, I would offer, it's more of a social sciences paper, but there's an essay written by a scholar from the University of Toronto, Eve Tuck, and her colleague Wang, called "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor." It's not a long paper, but I feel like it should be canon text for anyone asking that question, because what it really means is that we've been the academic world is very much based on, you know, these systems of peer review, and you get accolades for publishing, and your career sort of benefits from your kind of track record. and left in the wake of that can be a very kind of either ego-driven or agenda-driven, focused on what you're doing, rather than realizing that there are people and communities that are at the root of the content. And so really what we're talking about there is that, you know, I've been sort of probably unfairly harsh of the idea of anthropology recently. You know, I keep on saying to people, Indigenous people are no longer subjects to be studied. Like that's an ancient concept. Everybody's got to drop that, you know, but the idea of working together and ensuring that all people benefit from the research in the same way, that has to be core to what we're doing as academics. So that's my advice. Thanks.
That's great. Anyone else want to touch on that? I'll just add another question that came in that I see as linked, but maybe it's not as linked. There was a question about the role funding agencies should have on some of the issues you raised. So what could be some of the incentives, for example, that would ensure that we're taking the right approach? Do funding agencies have a role here?
I'll just kind of talk about, continue on from what David had mentioned, and reciprocity. The Indigenous strategy at USask is going to be gifted to the university. So it was developed by Indigenous peoples for the university, and it was informed by Indigenous people, developed by Indigenous people. So it wasn't, it wasn't non-Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples coming to the table to talk about an Indigenous strategy and how to develop it. It was Indigenous people, the Indigenous community, internal and external, that came together to talk about, okay, what's important for us within this organization, and what recommendations or calls to action would we like to impart on them. And so what will happen with this strategy is that elders will gift it to the university, and all of a sudden that switches language, because our systems are designed to adopt documents, right, and vote on them. And so what do you do with a gift like a strategy? And so automatically people had to reframe in order to, first of all, when they're looking at this, but in order to receive the gift. And Indigenous peoples are historically, we have a gifting economy. And so funding agents have to recognize that we have a gifting economy, and that it's very much a part of reciprocal and respectful relationship and partnerships. So there has to be, I think, some allowance for those gifting and recognition that is essential part of the partnership. And so in this process with the strategy, because there were Indigenous peoples that we were working with, that was already known, right? But there still is that teaching that has to happen in order to, I think, advance the idea of gifting within some of our organizations and the importance of it. It is a spiritual component of what we do. Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about the gifting economy in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, and she beautifully explains that. So funding agencies are so important to this work, and when you're thinking about something like gifting, again, that should be a part of the conversation also.
Yeah, Natalka, I'd like to add to Jacqueline's comments, and that, again, funding agencies, in the same way that we've talked about infrastructure, are the enabling mechanisms. And what you do when you're writing grant applications, or you're basically designing programs, what needs to be formally recognized is exactly the kinds of things that Jacqueline, David, and Melody have identified, of working with communities and building relationships. And building relationships takes time, it takes resources. I know right now we're under a period of restriction of seeing each other, face to face, but going into the communities having the communities come back to the federal facilities or to the laboratories, all of that takes investment, and that needs to be recognized as part of legitimate costs associated with conducting the work, whether you're applying to SHRC in the social sciences domain, the humanities, in the health sciences, or in the natural sciences areas. And right now, I would say that there's some work to do to basically ensure that those types of procedures, protocols, the approaches that we've discussed here have the space to be identified in those types of applications, but also recognized by the adjudication committees that this is an important piece to actually advance the work, rather than saying, well, this is not an area that we're going to we're going to give you a budget for, but you do have more money to buy another instrument or whatever it might be. I think, again, it's having this holistic perspective of how do we, coming back to the theme of this particular session, how do we braid knowledge systems and recognize that there's multiple ways of knowing and multiple ways of looking at the problem, and that needs to be properly supported.
Sorry, there's always a delay with my unmuting. So there's we could move to a couple of questions now that I feel are relevant to the conversations we had. So I'll just read one out. So over the course of this conference, we've heard about the lessons learned from COVID, that much work can be done remotely. And yesterday, a suggestion that international collaboration can be facilitated by having postdocs rent lab space in their local area rather than moving to the new lab. What we're learning here emphasizes the importance of being in the community. Is there a way that we can reconcile these two seemingly opposite threads? That's the question from the audience.
It's a good question. Oh, I'll let Jackie go ahead.
No, okay. I was just thinking that that often we were within, I don't want to pick on the sciences, but we look at things in a binary perspective, right? And it's either or, and yet how can we reframe this and say, how do they complement each other? And how could they work with each other? And I think that's a part of braiding this together, and seeing, complementary approaches. There was one elder, Dr. Reg Croshew from University of Calgary, who's always taught us that, you look for the parallel. You look for the parallel, you look for the strength from each, each perspective, each worldview. And if you look hard enough, you'll find them. And so rather than these tensions, and yet tension is important when you're braiding something, and especially, when you're wanting to create those really tight braids and relationship, you need more tension. But at the same time, how do we see some of these, how do we reframe some of these questions into ways that actually enable complementary approaches?
Yeah. I was just gonna add that this is something that we're dealing with as a School of Architecture. Our whole curriculum was based on place-based teaching, and now we've got some students in China and some that are in Toronto and wherever else. And one of the ways, it might be that our field is more transportable in many ways, but some of the things that we've talked about in terms of the Indigenous teachings or place-based teaching is that everybody's somewhere. So in essence, take it as an opportunity to maybe reconnect to your place in the world and wherever that may be. So in the sciences, I know it may be a little bit different, because I think some lab research is placeless or perceived to be placeless, but I still think maybe the education or the kind of pedagogical goals could be met by sort of linking it to wherever place that you are in a lab. I still think for me, this is just one of the core things that the world needs, going back to our climate change discussion, no matter what profession we're in, is how do we go about our day-to-day business in a way that reconnects us to the lands where we are. Otherwise, we'll never kind of get over that philosophical hump that really the earth must be respected and kind of in more of a sacred way for all of us. Otherwise, the climate change question is doomed. So I would hope maybe some of the lab research could, if that's the case, I think it's interesting, the idea you can do a postdoc in somewhere other than the lab that you're based in, and take it as an opportunity to use that to connect you to where you are.
I have another question that I can read out. So I chose this one because I think it connects a little bit to the conversation, but if I'm off, forgive me. So I think we were talking a little bit about the use of research and the importance of bringing community together to really get that more wholesome perspective. And so one question that we have from the audience is that this is somebody who says, I'm interested how non-Indigenous researchers can learn about Indigenous knowledge. I assume it would be important to connect with Indigenous communities in locally and in the field area of interest, but would be good to hear from the panel members and their recommendations on how to do this. So I'll leave it open.
Well, I'll maybe have a start at this. I think Jacqueline actually gave some very good examples of documents that are being produced both in, at a federal level, but also many universities are also beginning to look at this very carefully in terms of developing not only documents, but actually teaching modules of bringing together the right Indigenous scholars and others at the local scale, and being able to basically inform and teach individuals of how to best approach communities and do the work. In fact, I was just on a call yesterday at the University of Calgary, where we had exactly this discussion about how do we begin to inform and engage new scientists that want to come in and actively work with communities, and yet do not have a background to do that. And the university is developing, internal capacity, and increasingly so. It's good to see this increasing capacity to basically help and facilitate those interactions, including educating, individuals of how to best approach communities, protocol, ethical guidelines, data, all of the pieces that we've talked about and how to deal with that. So I think we're starting to move in that direction. It's certainly, we've got a long ways to go, but I think the other panelists probably have other examples where we are beginning to have educational products and programs developed by communities, developed by Indigenous organizations to help facilitate what we're trying to achieve here.
If I could just add, if we could also really start to make it a requirement versus an option. For example, we pushed very hard in the new federal Environmental Impact Assessment Act to ensure that it's required that Indigenous knowledge is included in environmental impact assessments. Before, in the previous act, in the CIA 2012 Act, it was an option, it was a recommendation, and we felt it wasn't strong enough. But actually having it a requirement now really puts the onus on those that are conducting environmental impact assessments that they have to do this. Otherwise, their applications are at risk of being unaccepted for review. So going back to the previous question about for funders, ensure it's a criteria in a funding application. If a funding application comes forward to funding organization, it doesn't have the recognition and the support of including Indigenous knowledge, then they shouldn't be supported. I think if we're going to really take the braiding of Indigenous knowledge really seriously, people need to ensure that it's required, that it's not just an option and something that is a best practice anymore. I think we need to move beyond that now and really pushing it, that it has to be done. Otherwise, it's going to really affect the credibility, put the applications at risk, and it really could affect the outcome and the results of the research.
I agree with that, and I think so it's developing capacity for those people that want to work alongside Indigenous peoples. And for instance, there's First Nation Information Governance Center has a fundamentals of OCAP training and certification, and so that is something that that everybody should take, because it does speak to how to respectfully work alongside or be led by Indigenous peoples and communities. And there are many things that I think need to be understood, and one of them is the difference between Indigenous methodologies and Indigenous research, right? And people who engage in Indigenous methodologies are the ones that have that lived experience, or who have earned the teachings from elders in the communities. And so in essence, you almost do have to be an Indigenous person to engage in Indigenous methodologies. Whereas Indigenous research, that's a broader field. You can be Indigenous or non-Indigenous in engaging in Indigenous research. But in both cases, it's how you conduct the research that is going to make the difference. And as we mentioned earlier, more and more Indigenous peoples are setting boundaries on and frameworks, engagement frameworks, whether it's based on ethical spaces or ethical relationality, than ever before. And Indigenous communities, in some cases, are conducting their own research and bringing in their own researchers, right, and filling out grant applications on their own. So, there's still a lot of space for collaboration, and I think it's important that we collaborate. So, yeah, I don't know if there's anyone else who'd like to contribute to that.
I just would like to back up or endorse what Fred had said, that I really do think universities need to play a strong role in this, because the question, is how as an non-Indigenous person does one engage? And many communities, I think you hear a lot with various bands that, like their offices are inundated with calls and interests, and even on campus, Indigenous faculty members are almost overwhelmed these days, because there's, in a good way, there's lots of interest. So, at our university, we about 4 years ago started the Mamuzing Indigenous Research Institute. And the goal of that institute is to do exactly what you're saying, so that a non-Indigenous researcher can kind of come to the institute, and they sort of have connections. They know the relations, they know who to put people in touch with. So I really feel universities need to play a leading role in some of that, because universities are regional. Usually there's good people there at the university and well connected. So I think for me it depends on the community, but some First Nations have more capacity to receive sort of a knock on the door and saying, hey, I want to work with you. But many First Nations are kind of saying, no, we got too many. We're loaded up right now. There's only so much we can take on. So there has to be some mechanism to connect.
I'll read one more question, because it's linked to something you've discussed. Many examples in the fields of natural resources, materials, climate, and so on. I think that was what they're saying. First Nation Information Governance Center is referenced, has been briefly cited. But would there be some other examples of Indigenous knowledge in relationship to computer science or data science? I think the question is, do you know of any other organizations that either collect data or are knowledge holders of related to computer science and data science. I think that's perhaps I just didn't help, but I wanted to read that out because it was a question, I think, related to First Nation Information Governance Center, which you had mentioned, but are there any other organizations like that you know of?
There's a website, and it's Indigenous Research Ethics Institute. And within that website, there are it's a compilation of academic research organizations that have developed documents, government research organizations, community-based research projects, international, and it goes on to Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples Data. And so that would be one place that I would suggest exploring, Indigenous Research Ethics Institute. And then again, and some of these areas are still emerging. And as I mentioned, most of our organizations, especially with the universities, have data management processes. And so it's important to, I'll say, decolonize and indigenize those documents, go back to them and see if there is representation, and explore and examine how, those processes are currently practiced, and how they could be amended to be more inclusive and equitable.
There is a discussion out there academically. I know one of my colleagues here at Laurentian, Dr. Jennifer Walker, she works in health science. There's this term called data sovereignty, and maybe that's something you might want to look into. I know in New Zealand, the Maori have also been leading that discussion about particularly health data and how to keep that information or how to manage that information. So there is a kind of conversation out there on Indigenous data sovereignty, but that's all I can think of.
In fact, there is interest for a lot of the references that you have made. There's an interest if there's a way to post them. So I think there is a way that we could post the titles that had been mentioned, so that people were interested in some of the organizations and books and articles that you had mentioned. Melody, did I stop you? Had you hoped to add something to that last?
No, I didn't have any further comments to add, Natalka. Thank you.
Okay. So we're running out of time, and I want to make sure that we have a chance to circle back to some of the questions that we had discussed previously, and just how do we ensure science-based policy making is effectively informed by both Indigenous and Western knowledge systems? And I think this would be an opportunity also just to share a key reflection that you each have on how this would contribute, or if you feel would contribute, to advancing reconciliation with Indigenous peoples within the federal science system. So I'm going to just open it up, and it's a big question, but I think there's a lot that you could cover here.
I could maybe start, because this is some of the work that we've have done and currently doing, as my opening example was about, developing thresholds and in the area of natural resource management, and trying to minimize and avoid environmental impacts and support conservation. I guess in terms of the braiding of knowledge and utilizing it in policy development is really the purpose and the objective of the policy itself. So if the policy and the objective is very much aligned and supportive of the Indigenous knowledge values for example, from my community. The example I provided was about water conservation. in the Athabasca River. So we saw the value of contributing to a policy like that because it really meant a lot to our values in water conservation for the purposes of our livelihood and use of the river system. So I think it's very important for policymakers to fully be aware of what is the intent of their policy, what is the purpose, and if there is value for Indigenous knowledge, which I think most of the time there is, especially in the area of natural resource management that I work in, then I think you will see a great amount of participation from Indigenous communities supporting that policy development with the inclusion of their knowledge. But if the policy is contradictory for the purposes of Indigenous knowledge, which our Indigenous knowledge is about, again, protecting our livelihood, sustaining our culture, and so if there's going to be policy that is to harm that, then of course, you know, there's an unwillingness to share in that area. So, for example, we talked about climate change and addressing the impacts of climate change. Well, I think you're going to see a lot, and we already do see a lot of Indigenous communities sharing information about the impacts of climate change and what can be done in terms of policy development and addressing those impacts. So they're very much a value system in terms of supporting that. There needs to be the recognition of also policymakers and treating Indigenous knowledge equal. I've seen a lot of policy developed with very minimal consideration of Indigenous knowledge, basically the ratio being like 9-to-1. So we need to really place a greater emphasis and importance, you know, that policies being developed needs to become a little bit more equal, that it just can't be, you know, 1 or 2 paragraphs in the policy that touches on it, but we need to start to raise the bar, I think, in terms of more stronger inclusion and recognition.
And I could expand on that. And so I think there's a saying, we resource what we value. And so I think we have to consider if we're saying we value Indigenous knowledge and we value Indigenous people's perspectives within this work, and that we see that perspective as essential because of their relationship with their territories, then it's got to show up in very prominent ways. And so one of the things Indigenous scholars in many universities have had a challenge in having their research recognized, and recognized in ways that will benefit them and recognize them in strong ways. And so in some cases they've had difficulty moving through the tenure process, the merit process, because their work is not seen is seen from a different perspective. Community-based research is not it's not as valued, or historically it hasn't been as valued or understood. Indigenous methodologies has not either. So then you go back to the policy that drives that kind of thinking. And within universities, it's the university standards for promotion and tenure. And within that document, it outlines how colleges and departments should evaluate and review CVs and research. And so what we did at the University of Saskatchewan is we brought together Indigenous scholars, a task force, and they reviewed that document, did internal and external scans, and actually rewrote the university standard document, and provided again it as a framework for change, right? And so that process is still moving through. It was by faculty relations and now colleges and departments are seeing how they could include Indigenous scholarship within their own policies. So you have to go back to what drives behavior within our institutions. You know, whether it's the merit processes, the awards processes, and see if Indigenous ways of being, doing, and knowing is reflected within those documents.
We have 26 seconds left, and I just wanted to make sure I took the opportunity to thank each of you very much for a really good discussion today, and encourage anyone who's listening to fill in the survey afterwards, and we'll also figure out how to send the references for the publications to make them available as well. Many thanks. Miigwech.